How are we doing? Really? All right, we're going to start again, and this does not count as my time. You guys just got done singing praises to the living God who created you and died for you, and you also don't live in West Virginia. And all you can do is, how are you doing today? All right. Hey, you learned earlier, my name is Caleb, and I live out in Los Angeles because my family and I enjoy not having money. And but it's beautiful. We like the sea. We like Disneyland. There's a whole bunch of things I like there. I love our church. It's the most ethnically, racially diverse church I've ever seen in my life, and I love that about our church out there. And I love the people out there. I really, really do. And man, I love our students. I love what is happening in your generation so much that even though I'm on staff in my church, I still volunteer as a high school small group leader. And I have 9 high school guys. I love them. They're morons, but they are awesome. And I truly believe that God is going to use you and use your generation to change the world. I think He already is. And whenever somebody complains about you like an older adult, my question is, okay, well, who raised them? I'm just saying, every generation is messed up, but I think, personally, there's so much hope that I have for you guys to change this world for Jesus, and I think you can do it. I want to start off, and I want to tell you about something that I don't talk a lot about because it was a weird experience, but I want to talk about the day that my son was born. Now, I know some of you have been in biology class and you've seen the videos of live births, okay? It does not do it justice of the awkwardness that happens when you're in that room. So anyway, I remember my wife and I, when we first got married, we immediately tried to have kids because we were insane and we didn't know any better. And we tried, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't get pregnant. And so my wife just started going through a depression. I did too. I threw myself in my work. She started watching Twilight movies over and over again. And I'm like, well, we're going to get you pregnant one way or another. Hopefully, maybe another immaculate conception. Let's find out. And so we went to a fertility clinic. We got pregnant with our son Joel on number 1 try. And it took 2 tries. We got pregnant with my 15-year-old daughter, Rachel. And I love both of them, but I got to tell you about Joel's birth because when we found out we were pregnant, we were the annoying couple that told everybody about our baby that's coming in the world. And we lost friends, and we didn't care. We'd get new friends because we were pregnant. And I was so excited to go to the hospital. I knew what to expect because I had seen the movies, you know. I knew the baby was going to come out pristine clean, and the baby was going to grab my finger, and with perfect pronunciation, the baby was going to say, Father. This is going to be the first words. Like light would be shining down from heaven, epic underscoring Star Wars John Williams music or Hans Zimmer. And you know what? That is not what happened. Everything was going great until the pain hit my wife, and then she became somebody that I had not exchanged vows with at that point. I put my hand on her shoulder to try to comfort her, and she looked at me, and her eyes were glowing red, and she said, "Don't you touch me right now, especially you." And I said, "Can we get a couple of Catholic priests in here to do their thing? We need something." And then the doctor came in and gave her drugs, and she went back to loving God and others at that point. And again, everything was great until my son came into the world. The doctor comes in when it's time for my son to make his grand entrance. The doctor puts out plastic all over the floor, and they come in hazmat outfits with like a welding mask. And I go up to the doctor, and I'm like, is something getting ready to explode? Because I'm the only one not covered, and it looks like something's going down in here. And so the doctor gets in the football position, you know. And my son comes into the world, this moment that I have been dreaming of. And when he came into the world, my expression went from this to, oh. I was like, I think you can put him back. He needs to cook some more. He was a Crayola color that Crayola had never invented a crayon for. His head, I had never seen the shape that his head was. It was triangular, circular, octagonish, pentagonish. It was a rectangle. It had all the infinity stones. It was just something that I hadn't seen before. And then, like he smelled weird. And he made this weird noise. They weren't cute, like, they were, the doctor's like, you want to hold him? I'm like, really? Doctor wrapped him up, gave him to me. I have ADHD. I don't always have a filter. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's not. In this moment, I didn't have a filter. And these were my first words about my son. The doctor said, what do you think? And I said, he looks like a turtle. Those were the very first words. And when my daughter came into the world, she came out looking like a cross between a ladybug and my mother. And I said, well, that's disturbing. I hope that changes soon. And it did, praise God. And, like, here I am. And, like, if you had been there, it was messy. It really was. It looked like a B-rated horror movie had happened in that room. Because you will see things that you didn't even know existed. And you're like, oh, no, you will, trust me. You will. Trust me, you're not, just trust me, dude. And so, here I am. And I'm holding my turtle, and I'm holding my ladybug. And in this moment, I just love my kids. I just love them. And you know what? They didn't do anything to deserve that love. Like, they didn't. You're like, yes, Caleb, they're adorable. Not at first. You know, like since I've had children, you know, like, they have gotten me sick. They have taken money from me. I used to look like Ryan Gosling, and then I had children, and this happened. So if you have kids, this is what you have to look forward to. No, Gru, Dr. Evil, and Uncle Fester. I'm serious. I love my kids. My son is now 6'4". Like, he does Krav Maga, which is Israeli martial arts. It is like so like difficult and violent, they don't even have tournaments. And then Joel's like, Dad, you should come with me to the studio because they teach them all of the martial arts that they teach the Israeli army. They're like, Dad, you should come. I said, no. I have nothing left to prove. My wife is hot. Muy caliente. And I'm not going to give you an excuse to punch me in the throat. You know, because you can do it there. You're like, I don't know, he ran into the fist. I don't know, he's old. He's in his 40s, man. I'm not going to do that. And here's the thing. I still love my kids. I do. And they stress me out. They really, really do. But I love them so much, and I would do anything for them. And you got to hear me on this, okay? In your life, you're going to make mistakes. You will. And there's some of you in here, you've already made mistakes. There's some of you in here, you made big mistakes. You made mistakes nobody knows about, and you hope nobody else finds out about. You think things about other people. You're like, I'm glad this isn't auditory where everybody can hear it. And yet, one day it just comes out of your mouth what you think, and you're like, I don't know where that came from. And it's like from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. That's where it comes from. You will make mistakes. You are having a great week. You've had amazing speakers. You have phenomenal worship. You have Damian Spickrite up here every morning. Like Kendall up here. He's a great communicator. Love that guy. You have an incredible week. You have volunteers that have taken off time from their work to be with you. You have staff that is here with you. You hopefully are making new friends, reuniting with old friends, but you're going to go back, and you're going to be on a mountain high, spiritual high, and that's great. But you got to understand that eventually you will make mistakes. And what you do right after the moment when you make a mistake matters more than you will ever know. What you do in that moment, when you make a mistake, when you do something that you never thought you would do, what you do in the following moments, it means the world. And there's a whole lot more that hangs in the balance than what you know. Now, I do want to say this. When I say some of you made mistakes, there are other people that have made mistakes and you have been part of the mistake. They've done something to you. That is not a mistake you've made. That is not what I'm talking about tonight. I hope you know that. I'm talking about willful, I want to do this. Like I heard this one preacher one time say, I don't know, he didn't talk like this, but I have to mimic him like this. Wouldn't it be great to be a Christian even if Jesus didn't exist? I'm like, no. You know why? I'm just being honest. Can I be honest? Because I don't like saying no to myself. Do you? I like doing what I want to do. Listen. Nobody buys into my opinions like I do. They're my opinions. Nobody buys into your opinions like you do. And look, I don't agree with everything Jesus said, but I obey him. I don't agree with it. Like, for instance, revenge. I wish he would let us get revenge. I'm good at it. I put a dead fish in my ex-roommate's heater. Another guy that went out on a date with the girl I was dating, I took his toothbrush, cut off the bristles, sprinkled them in his bed sheets. I like it. But Jesus says no. I don't agree with him. I'm like, all right, I'm good at it, Jesus, and you're holding me back. But Jesus says, no, you let me handle things. You don't. And I obey him. But I'm going to make mistakes. And so I want us to look at somebody that was somebody that Jesus gave one of the biggest compliments to that you could ever imagine. And he made a huge mistake. And what happened after he made a mistake is the reason why we're talking about this here. And it's what I want you to remember. So, you don't have to turn here yet if you have your Bibles. I'm just going to tell you. So, we're going to be talking about a guy named Peter. Okay? Now, when Peter first started following Jesus, Jesus called him by the name Simon. The original meaning of the word Simon is pebble. That's the original meaning. And in Matthew 16, 15 through 18, Jesus is talking to the disciples. He's like, hey, who do people say that I am? Like some people are like, oh, Christ, some teacher, everything, this and that. And then Peter says, you are the Christ, Son of the living God. And Jesus says, hey, I tell you what, you are no longer Simon the pebble. You are Peter, Petros in Greek, the rock. And it's upon this rock, that statement, your leadership, that I'm going to build my church. That's a huge compliment. And you got to know at that point, Peter's like, all the other disciples were like, I was going to say that. He talked first. Can I say that too? But Peter was the one that spoke up. He was the leader. And everybody looked to him as the leader. And then, about a year and a half later, Jesus is having dinner with his disciples on the night that he was betrayed by Judas. He was having what we call the very last supper, kind of a repeat of Passover. And Jesus is talking to them and telling them what's coming. And then he looks at Peter, and this whole time in Matthew, from Matthew, it is 16 onward until this chapter, he is called Peter, Peter. But in this moment, in Luke 31, 22, 31, he calls him Simon. He goes back to calling him who he was. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, that you will strengthen your brothers. I'm praying for you, Simon, that your faith won't fail, but I know that it will because you have this issue called being a human. And you will make mistakes. And then he says, but I'm praying that when you turn back, you will strengthen everybody else. And here's what Simon says. He says in Luke 22:33, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and death. There are some of us, we're on a spiritual high. We're like, Lord, I would follow you to prison and death. I would follow you to North Korea. I would follow you to the most dangerous place in the world, a Raiders game. And here's what Jesus says in verse 34. I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. And you know what Peter does? You know what Peter does because that's what you and I do. Jesus, you're wrong on this one. You've been right, but this is the one time because I know me. I know me. I'm not going to betray you. So you remember what happens, right? Judas comes, leads all the soldiers to Jesus. They arrest him. All the disciples run, including Peter. And Peter goes to a courtyard where he's actually warming his hands. And it's the courtyard that Jesus is going to walk through. It says in Luke 22, verse 54, then seizing Jesus, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some people there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, they sat down together, and Peter sat down with them. Now, keep this in mind. Kindled a fire, that's the word charcoal. That's going to be important in a second. It says in verse 56, the servant girl came to him by the firelight. She looked closely at him, and she said, this man was with him. But Peter denied it. Woman, I don't know him. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you are also one of the disciples. Here's what Peter said, man, I am not. Verse 59, about an hour later, another person asserted that you were with the Lord. Certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean. Peter replied, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Just as he was speaking, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. There's a word for that. Busted. How do you think that felt in that moment? When Peter literally had to eat his words. And Jesus just looks at him. Real quick, I want to ask you, how do you think Jesus looked at him? Do you think Jesus looked at him like, do you think Jesus looked at him with wrath? Or do you think Jesus looked at him with love? When you make a mistake, and there's nobody harder on yourself, when you think about the way Jesus looks at you when you make a mistake, do you believe that he's looking at you like a wrathful, vengeful, I'm going to get you, God? Or do you think he's looking at you with grace and sympathy and saying, my daughter, my son, you don't have to be in this moment. You don't have to live in the toxicity of shame. I did not die on the cross for you to flog yourself, to live in the toxicity of shame over and over and over again. And then Peter, he ends up running away. And Jesus is crucified. And then Jesus resurrects. And Jesus actually appears to all the disciples. And yet Peter and the other disciples, you know what they do? They go back to fishing. They were fishermen back when Jesus first called them. And they go back. In Peter's mind, the fact that God said, you are going to be a rock. And on this statement on your leadership, I'm going to build my church. You're going to be an encouragement. And when you have come back to your faith, I want you to turn around and I want you to encourage the other disciples. But Peter thinks that's over. Because even though Jesus resurrected, I still made a mistake. Jesus said I had this purpose, but my mistake took away that purpose. And so now I have to go back to working to try to prove myself, to try to work and prove my dignity, my worth, my value. And so one day when they were fishing, they see Jesus. Peter's so excited to see him. He jumps off the boat. I don't know if you ever saw Forrest Gump when Forrest jumped off the boat. It appears that you haven't. That's your fault, not mine. Don't gaslight me. He jumps off the boat. He swims over to Jesus. And it says in John 21, verse 9, when the disciples landed, they saw a fire of burning coals. That is the same Greek word as what we read in Luke 22 when it says that Peter warmed himself by the fire when Jesus was being questioned. That's the only two times this word for charcoal appears in the New Testament. In Luke's gospel and John's gospel, and the Holy Spirit is telling us something. That what's about to happen is very similar to what happened in that courtyard. What happened there? The scene is going to be similar to what happens here. So Jesus made breakfast, and he made fish for breakfast. Obviously because he didn't love the disciples much. He would have made them Captain Crunch, I think. I don't know. He was still disciplining them. Who knows? How many of you like fish? Okay, somebody. Two people need to get saved. A fish is basically a vegetable. It's not real meat, okay? It's not, steak is meat. Is somebody really booing for fish? Okay, you are awesome. Okay, look at this. John 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Probably pointing at the disciples. Peter said, yes, Lord. He said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Verse 16, again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. He answered, take care of my sheep. The third time, he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. And in this moment, you got to understand, there are different words for love in the New Testament. There's the word eros, there's the word strage, there's the word phileo, and there's the word agape. Phileo is relational love, and agape is God's love. It's sacrificial love. And Jesus asked him in the original language, do you agape me? And Peter says, you know that I phileo you. And then Jesus asked him a second time, do you agape me? And Peter says, you know that I phileo you. And then the third time Jesus says, do you phileo me? And Peter says, you know that I phileo you. Now there are some scholars and commentators that read into this too much because they don't have a life. And they're like, well, Jesus had to dumb down the idea of love because Peter didn't understand it. And I'm like, I think he understood it perfectly. You know what I think? This is not the same Peter that said, you know what? I would go and die for you. This is a Peter that is broken. This is a Peter that has been humbled. And in this moment, I think Peter is saying phileo, not because he loves Jesus less, but because he has an understanding of his fallibility as a human being. He has this understanding that he will make mistakes, that he did make a mistake, and he doesn't want to repeat that. And so when Jesus says, I think, personally, one person's opinion, do you phileo me? I don't think he's dumbing down the idea of love. I think that he's meeting Peter where he's at, and he's saying, you really do love me. You understand where you're at and what you can do in this moment. And I think Peter said, you know that I phileo you. Notice that he denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus asked him 3 times here, do you love me? You were with a man, you were with a man, you were with a man. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Burning charcoals over here, burning charcoals over here. This is what some people call the reinstatement of Peter. But the lesson is far bigger than this, and it has a principle that you need to grasp onto, because I know this about all of you. Here's how I know this about all of you, because you're human. You are breathing. You are a human being, and I know that you're going to make mistakes, and I know that you're going to make some big ones. And some of you haven't forgiven yourself of something you've done. Maybe other people have forgiven you. Maybe you've confessed it to God, and He's forgiven you. But you are negating the forgiveness of God and saying it's more important for me to feel better, for me to forgive myself to feel better. Therefore, I've got to wait till I feel better, and then I'll know that God has truly forgiven me. No, that's you beating yourself up. And here's the principle that I want you to understand. That despite your mistakes, Jesus still gives you purpose. No matter what you've done, Jesus gives you purpose. Listen, you are not saved on your own. You cannot walk away from Jesus on your own. You did nothing to earn Jesus' love. You're not going to do something that makes Jesus go, oh, dude, no, I'm done. Other people will walk out on you. Some of you, you've had parents walk out on you. You've had church staff. You've had leaders. You've had friends. You've had family members. You've had people walk away. Some of you haven't, but you will one day, because that's part of the human experience. For some of you, you've had a whole lot more life than you let people know, and you've had a lot of hurt. And when you make a mistake, all of a sudden, your image of God is shaped by the way that older people and parental figures and guardians, whether they are good or bad, and how they treated you and other people, that impacts your view of God. And you kind of see God through that lens, and you're like, I made a mistake, and God's just doing a facepalm and walking away. God never leaves. You are not defined by your mistakes. Hear me on this. Your primary identity is not in your mistakes. Your primary identity is not in where you live. It is not in your sexuality. It is not in your gender. It is not in your grade. It is not in your politics. It is not even in the church you attend. Your primary identity is defined by Jesus and Jesus alone. He is the one that has given you purpose. You didn't do anything to earn that purpose. What makes you think you're good enough to lose that on your own? See, the real problem is, some of you, you struggle with believing that God and others can love you after a mistake because you don't love you after a mistake. And I get it. God said, love God, love people, and I'm people, and I got to love myself in a non-narcissistic way. I got to take care of myself, but I will tell you, the person in the mirror is not only somebody I'm supposed to love, that is the person that sabotages me more than anyone else. And it's hard to love that individual, but you are not defined by your mistakes. Our church in Los Angeles, it's a good-sized church. Good size. We have about 14,000 to attend. And recently, Rihanna's been coming, believe it or not. Now, I think that's great. And I heard a couple of church members say, well, why is she here? I just put my arm around both of them because I know them. I'm like, why are you here? Now I know about both of you. Why are you here? What are you saying? I'm like, why can't she be? I'm glad she's here. Did you see her last video? No, I don't. I listen to 80s music because I'm awesome. But regardless of the nun video, I'm glad that she's here. She needs to be here. You need to be here in your church. And there are going to be days when you feel like, I don't want to go. You go. You owe it to yourself. Oh, God just had it with me. No, He hasn't. He has not. He did not send His Son to die on the cross so He could give up on you because of a mistake. He has still called you. I want to end with this. Okay? couple of you may know my story. It's in the book. I wrote Messy Grace. Some of you don't, but like I said, I've kind of bounced from Columbia to Kansas City, lived in Joplin, got out of there quickly, but lived there. It's a great Bible college, and live in Los Angeles now, that kind of thing. My parents were both professors at the University of Missouri, Columbia, Kansas City, and Stevens College, and when I was 2 years old, they divorced, and both of them went into same-sex relationships. And my whole childhood, I was raised by 3 LGBTQ parents who were activists. My mom used to be friends with Hillary. My mom used to go to all these political events. I was growing up. My mom and her partner, Vera, were together in Kansas City. My dad was more in the closet, never had a monogamous partner. My mom and her partner were together for 22 years until her partner died of cancer. And I grew up with my parents taking me to bars, gay bars and gay clubs, and pride parades, campouts, house parties. And I remember this one pride parade, and activist events, but in this one pride parade, I remember there are all these quote-unquote Christians. I don't think they really were, but they were holding up signs saying, God hates you. And when people from my mom's parade would go try to talk to them, they would throw water and urine on them, saying, this is what Jesus thinks of you. I remember looking at my mom. I was like 9 or 10 or 11 or something like that, and I said, Mom, why are they acting like that? She said, well, Caleb, they're Christians, and Christians hate gay people. If you are not like them, they will not like you. And I saw Christian families ignoring young sons dying of AIDS in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. I saw the hurt and the devastation. And I grew up thinking, here's what I thought. I never want to be a Christian. Because if Jesus is their leader and Christians are this bad, I can't imagine how awful he is. We really underestimate how much our words and our actions impact other people either following Jesus or walking away from him. And so by the time I got to be 16, I was sneaking out. Didn't need to sneak out. My parents didn't care. I was living it up, partying. My hair was down to here. Since then, the Lord removeth. And I didn't know that was funny, but yeah, he did. I lost a bet with him, I think. But I ended up being invited by another high schooler in my school to go to a Bible study for high schoolers, and I thought this is going to be perfect. I'm going to go and pretend to be a Christian and dismantle their faith. And that worked out real well, as you can tell. I went there, and I started studying what the Bible had to say. And dude, it was weird for me at first. I was an unchurched kid. I had never stepped foot in a Christian household before. Never, ever, ever, never. And I mean, I walk into their house, it looked like they raided a Bible bookstore. My friend comes up from the basement and says, we've circled up downstairs, won't you join us? And I'm thinking, well, this is like a horror movie. We're not even at the opening credits and we're going down. I mean, I've seen Unsolved Mysteries. I've listened to true crime. I know you don't go to basements and you don't camp with people you don't know. You just don't do that. You'll be the subject of a true crime podcast. But I went down there. They told me to turn to 1 Corinthians. Everybody's reading a verse from one of the chapters in 1 Corinthians. I couldn't find it. I didn't know that God had put a table of contents in this baby. I read a verse from 1 Chronicles thinking, they're not going to know the difference. I read a verse about some dude getting impaled. They're like, where are you? Well, I'm in 1 Chronicles. Oh, you're in the Old Testament. I'm like, is there a new one? Do we have updated 2.0? I didn't know that. That's okay. I thought the Bible was written by a bunch of boring, dead Middle Eastern people. That's what I thought. Well, the more that I read that Jesus was not like the people on the street corners, or dare I say today, people on social media. Jesus actually loved people, and he challenged people to live for him. He challenged his followers to holy living. But he also made room for people who were nothing like him, that the religious elite had pushed to the side because they were too messy. They had made too many mistakes. Whatever purpose God had given them, it's gone because of all the mistakes they had made. And yet Jesus loved them, and they liked him back. And I started studying what the Bible at the age of 16 had to say about sexuality, marriage, relationships, and that's going to be a big deal. And I came to two conclusions that I still hold today. That God designed sex to be expressed in a marriage between one male and one female, but biblical beliefs are never reasons to devalue another human being. And I believe both. Because my view, you can't read this and think that God is okay with anything other than that kind of marriage. But my view of marriage does not impact the way that I treat other people. It just doesn't, because I'm not a weirdo. And so, this is actually, believe it or not, 30 years ago this month, I was at a CIY in Bolivar, Missouri. I had been a Christian for a week. I called my friend Greg on a Thursday. I said, Greg, I think I've turned Christian. What should I do? He said, let's eat Chinese food and I'll baptize you. Okay. A week later, we were at a CIY conference. I went forward to give my life to the ministry. I want to tell everybody about Jesus. Everyone. Then, at the age of 16, I had to come out as a Christian to my 3 activist LGBTQ parents, and they kicked me out. Eventually, they let me back in. I went to Ozark. Preached at several churches while I was in Bible college. Preached at one church for 18 months. Brought my mom to church one time with me. We were in a town of 50, 25 people were in our church. We were the largest church per capita in the world at that time. Half our city was won for Christ. My mom came to church with me. The next Sunday, she didn't come, but 2 elders were waiting for me on the doorstep. They said, if you want to keep preaching here, don't you ever bring somebody like your mom again. You know what I said? I quit. I'm done. Bye-bye. I'm going to go to McDonald's. Bye. And I started to leave. They're like, no, Caleb, you need to preach. I said, oh, you don't want that. Not after this. They're like, we need a sermon. I said, okay. And there's an old, singer. You may have heard of him, Bon Jovi, back in the 80s and 90s. He wrote a song called Blaze of Glory, that if you're going to go out. So I took my sermon and ripped it up. It was on fasting. Nobody cares about that. And I went up there and I preached about grace and truth. And I said, God, if you ever let me be in a church, I want to be in a church filled with people who are messy, who are making mistakes, who have made mistakes, who are questioning their faith, people who are homeless, people who are using, people who are addicts, people who have been in gangs, people who are questioning their sexuality, people who are questioning who they are, people who have been divorced 10 times, people who have been married 10 times, people who have no money, people who have all money, because that is what the church is. It is a beautiful mosaic of messy, broken lives, of people that made mistakes, that God unites together to glorify himself. God is not glorified in you trying to make everybody think you're perfect. He is glorified in your surrender. Like what Peter did. Lord, you know I love you. Lord, I'm sorry. You know I love you. So like I said, I got to end here. I moved to Texas 3.5 years because everybody's got to live in purgatory. The food's great, though. If your goal is to ever gain weight in life, move there. It'll happen. Go to the Texas State Fair. If you've never had fried bubble gum, that's where they invented the corn dog. If you've never had fried Frito-Lay pie and you want to die early, eat it. You will love it. It's a good way to go. It is gross. And so I preached for 3.5 years. My mom and dad moved down to Dallas, Texas. My mom's partner had died of cancer. And unless a miracle happened, she died without Christ. They moved down to Texas. Started attending the church I was preaching at. And people there treated them well, even though they disagreed with them. You see, some people think everything will get better if we don't disagree anymore. That's not true. We need to learn how to disagree better, not less. As a matter of fact, they treated them so well that at the ages of 69, 70, my mom and dad gave their lives to Jesus Christ. Because where this first church was like, you don't have your purpose, you made mistakes, I'm going to push you to the side. This church was like, no, come be with us. Let's adult together. Let's human together. They treated them like people, not like projects. And you know, in the last 2 years, I've lost both my parents. They're both with the Lord now. I remember getting the call. My mom had died. She'd been fighting cancer. She lost her battle. Or she won it in Christ, whichever way you want to say it. But she really suffered. And I remember when she died. I was on my way to church on Saturday night. We have Saturday evening service. And it was surreal. A nurse called me. My dad had died about a year earlier, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't tell my kids yet. I wanted them to have a good time at church that evening, and I was going to tell them afterwards and drop them off. Then I go to my office, put my stuff down. Then I go into the auditorium. Worship had already begun. And in that moment, everybody was singing and praising these worship songs. And in that moment, I started crying. Because I thought, that is exactly what my parents are doing right now. They are standing before the throne of the Lamb, singing with the choruses of the elders and the creatures and the angels and the saints and everybody. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Why? Because there were a bunch of Christians that disagreed with them because of good theology, but they still treated them well, like human beings. And they made them understand. They made them know that just because you made a mistake, you have not lost your purpose. You can rest. You don't have to prove yourself because Jesus already did it for you on the cross. Some of you, God has called into full-time vocational ministry. We're going to talk about that in a second. You are not disqualified. You are not. And everybody in this room, everybody, God has called you to make disciples. He has called you to share His gospel. He has called you to help people understand who He is. You don't have a choice as to whether or not you do this. As a matter of fact, if you don't want to, that might be a good reason not to be a Christian, because you don't have a choice. When you believe, you're in the army. Some of you He has called into full-time ministry. All of you, full-time vocational ministry. All of you He has called into full-time ministry. Don't shortchange what He did for you on the cross because of a mistake and you can't forgive yourself. Learn how to forgive yourself because He forgave you first. You are not your mistake. Let me pray for you. Lord, thank you so much for your